To get an idea of what was going on at the time, Ezekiel lived with Jewish exiles in a settlement along the river Chebar, which they called Tel Abib. We see that in Ezekiel 3, verse 15. It was located a little less than 100 miles south of Babylon. The invading Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem and brought 10,000 Jews back to this village about 597 BC, according to Ezekiel. And Ezekiel and the last king of Judah, Jehoiachin, were also brought prisoner and left in that village. Now, Ezekiel began his ministry about 5 years after he arrived there. We see that in Ezekiel 1:2. And he continued prophesying to the people for about 22 years. We see that in Ezekiel 29:17. God called him to speak to the Israelites, the same Israelites that God had exiled because of their continued rebellion against him. He took away his protection, had had enough of their sins, and used Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Jerusalem and take them captive. And all this happened about 125 years after the same thing had happened to the northern kingdom of Israel when they were taken away by the Assyrians. Idolatry, murder, a total deterioration of the moral fiber of that day, it was all that God can stand in his own people. So he had to do something about it. They had to be punished. And God used Nebuchadnezzar to take them out of Israel and into exile. However, that didn't stop God's people from their wickedness, and God wanted desperately for his people to return to him. So God chose Ezekiel to bring his message of warning to the house of Israel. Look at verse 3:18 with me. God tells Ezekiel how he's going to do his job. He says, if I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked of his wicked way in order to save his life, that wicked person shall die for his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the wicked and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his wicked way, he shall die for his iniquity, but you will have delivered your soul. Ezekiel was not going to be a physical watchman, but a spiritual watchman. If a wicked person wasn't warned by Ezekiel that his sins were repulsive to God and that he needed to change, the sinner would keep on acting the way he always had, and he will die. But God would require penalty from Ezekiel because he failed to warn him. Just like the Roman soldiers, when Peter escaped, they failed to do their job, so they were put to death. And that's a lot of pressure to put on an evangelist, especially over a flock of about 10,000. But look at verse 19 on the positive side. If the wicked man heard the warning and chose not to obey, then he would still die in his sins. However, Ezekiel's soul would be guiltless. The sinner knew then, by receiving the warning, that his sins were offensive to God. But he made the choice to continue on in his sins. Ezekiel warned him, and he did his job. But still, it's life and death circumstances. But see, it wasn't Ezekiel's job just to warn the wicked. Look at verse 20. Again, if a righteous person turns from his righteousness and commits injustice, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die. Because you have not warned him, he shall die for his sin, and his righteous deeds that he has done shall not be remembered, but his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the righteous person not to sin, and he does not sin, he shall surely live, because he took warning, and you shall have delivered your soul. God's warning to Judah was not just to the wicked, but to the righteous, to those who had been caught up in sin. And Ezekiel preached God's message for about 22 years. He had to, or the blood of those who died in their sins would have been on his hands. He had God's saving message. Without hearing it, they would have been lost, all of them. I want to take a minute to dwell on this. Sometimes when we think about evangelism,